Kate Goodger, thank you so much for joining us for this TED Talk today.
Hello, Simon. Really nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Not at all. And Kate, perhaps we could just kick off by asking you just give a brief introduction to yourself, if that's okay.
Certainly, yeah. By way of background, I was a PE teacher in 1842. It feels like quite a while ago, and I've always had a passion for working with individuals, and it actually led me to focus more on the kind of psychological makeup of people. So I then retrained as a performance psychologist, and the last 20 years has been in Olympic sports, applying those skills with athletes, coaches, and support teams as part of Team GB.
Wonderful. So we're going to go in 20 minutes. So we're going to have a great opportunity to dive into decision making in a very particular context, which is high performance sports. So fantastic. So Kate, as you know, our subject is decision making. What influences us? And perhaps we can start by just inviting you to give a sort of general reflection on that question from your perspective. You know, what are the sorts of things that just in broad terms that influences when we're thinking about decision making? Obviously, in your case, the context of sport.
It's a great question in the context of sport, because there are so many variables on so many levels. When I was reflecting on it, I think the critical part for me is working with the individual to understand what influences their decision making, because you could create a laundry list of factors that are biological and physiological, lifestyle based. Certainly with athletes, we tend to kind of focus on 5 key areas around the athlete. So that's their mental or psychological side, their physical, their technical, their tactical, and then overarching the lifestyle. So they are 5 key areas that you continually work around based upon what the athlete's needs are. And decision making is relevant in each of those areas. And then you've got the further lens of history affecting it from a psychological basis, and also future influencing it. So that question around what influences decision making, I actually find that's a really key one to work with athletes to help them understand themselves as a decision maker, and the type of things that influence them personally.
That's really interesting. So that's great. They've given us a broad influence of the sort of categories of things that influence their decisions. Could I just perhaps invite you, because of the particular context of this, when we're talking about decision making in sport, is it possible to sort of categorize or say what that is? I mean, it might be a really stupid question actually, because I expect many people play sport. What are we talking about when it comes to a decision making in the context, a decision in the context of sport?
And what I'd suggest is there is generally, when people think about sport and they think about decision making, they think about decision making under pressure. And that's absolutely an area that we're focusing on. What we want the athlete to do is essentially create enough space and time to be able to make the right decisions, or to make them automatically, because we know if we think too much about stuff, our body slows down. And in the athletic domain, that's not the part of the brain that we want to be using. It needs to be that autopilot, because simply we go faster, we can anticipate better in a match or where the ball might go. So there's the competition-based decision making. And then from that is also a sequence of decisions which are around planning. And athletes that are working towards an Olympics, that's at least a 4-year cycle, sometimes an 8-year cycle, sometimes a 12-year cycle. So there are decisions there which are technically off the field, which may be around their lifestyle, where they base themselves for training, or the particular type of coach. There are key decisions that they must make around equipment and the type of training they'll take on or they won't, and things like nutrition. So there's a part which is about the stuff that sits off the field that enables the athlete to get to that competition environment in the best shape possible. And that decision making is a really thorough process that's agreed across the support team, and ideally with the athlete at the center of decision making. Conversely, where athletes maybe have had challenges in the past and some difficulties when they have felt they haven't been a decision maker, and that lots of things have been imposed upon them. And then you have the decision making on the field, and that decision making is ultimately about performance. Will this help my performance, or will it hurt my performance? And that is much more ultimately at the automatic level on the majority of sports. Apart from a contrast might be a sport like sailing, where you're doing real-time decision making when you're looking at the weather and kind of what's happening in front of you in that physical environment.
which almost creates perhaps a sort of category 2A or a third category of decision making from those broad, the two that you set out for us. Fantastic. So in terms of those two broad areas of decision making, presumably as a sports psychologist, your approach is very different when you're considering the decision making process and how you support an athlete. I get those seem to be two very different sorts of environments for decision making. Is that right?
They're definitely contrasting approaches you would use with athletes, and the types of skills for athletes to help support their decision making are different in those two. What anchors them ultimately is the reference point for the decision making. So there's a great book by Ben Hunt Davis, an Olympic rower, and he simply asks one question: will this make the boat go faster? And it's a fantastic performance question, because if it's not helping you, or it's depleting energy and it's not aiding performance, then don't do it, then get rid of it. So a really important piece of work for athletes is to be abundantly clear on what they're trying to achieve and what that really means for them. And most people would go, well, it's an Olympic gold medal, isn't it? But actually there's a lot more behind that in terms of what does that mean to the athlete, because that affects decision making. If an athlete is attaching identity and self-worth to the medal, lots of the decision making will be more emotional in nature. Whereas if an athlete is about, this is me challenging myself to be the very best I can be, there's sometimes more objectivity around that decision making. So what links both of those domains is the clarity of focus of what ultimately are we trying to achieve here. And it's interesting, athletes that I've come across over the years, when you say, what's the mountain here? What's the thing that we're really aiming for? And they'll say, well, I think I should probably aim for the Olympics. And as soon as they use that word should, it becomes really interesting, because that's really different from athletes that are like really wired to, I want to perform at the Olympics. I want to see the best that's out there and how I match against them. So it's really important to get that clarity of what's this person's mission, purpose, anchor that they're working towards.
And that's the red thread that runs through what can sometimes, as you say, be even an 8-year process, all the way through to those presumably split-second decisions that they're making in performance. So the red thread linking that is that clarity of purpose.
Yes.
And therefore what? How, perhaps you could just unpick for us a little bit more about how you therefore work with an athlete through some quite different sorts of decision-making processes, I guess, to have them retain that focus and clarity. So how do you do your profession, I suppose, in a nutshell? How do you do that? But perhaps relating it to the decision-making process.
In the first instance, the objective is always, what is this person trying to achieve? What's the outcome, the end state that we're working towards? And then, the scoping out of do they need to achieve that? What would define success? What creates success for them? And then also the question of what might stop them, what might get in the way. And by giving that frame, it enables you to think about where athletes are now. They have to use a lot more sport intelligence that's different to 40 years ago, because you have athletes, say in the sport of equestrian, where you're managing sponsors and you're managing owners of horses. So sometimes the horse is actually better than the athlete that's going to the Olympics, and there's a lot of pressure around that. So how do they make decisions to ensure that their setup is as good as it possibly can be? And then when we start to focus more in on the performance environment, it's really understanding the nature of decision making in that environment. And sometimes that's about stripping out the number of decisions athletes make. So making things much more routine, much more habitual from the day of competition. What does that routine look like on, from 7 a.m. in the morning until they finish competing? And if the routine's in place, you're taking less decision making out of it. If you've practiced the potential scenarios for different conditions that you could face, or different scenarios in a race. So we do a lot of what if planning. What if the first lap is slower than you intend it to be, or the pace is quicker than you anticipated? How do you respond to that? So a big focus is about being able to enable athletes to strip out unnecessary decisions or lower level decisions, and to really hone in on where are those areas where decision making might be most challenged. So if you take a sport like bobsleigh, and if I think about the bobsleigh team in Sochi was a particularly tricky course, because there was a bend, I think it was either bend 3 or 5, but depending on how you entered that and exit that, it would either act as an accelerator for the rest of the course, or it would be a brake for the rest of the course. So if you hit into the side there, you're having to recalculate your decisions because of, okay, what's the consequence of that? So there's real-time decision making that athletes want to or have to make. And our job is to try and create space and time to make the right decision. And that's not an easy thing to do. Or we want the athlete simply to go to that autopilot and actually not to think. Know that the decision has already been made as part of their training. When this happens, you do this, because it enables them to work at speed and under pace then.
Is there a in that, on that last point that you mentioned, Kate, psychologically, is there a difference in how you prepare an athlete? Because you presented as an either or in a sense, creating the space and the time for the decision, or not, I suppose, but making sure that they're prepared for it and they can take the decision instinctively. Is that something that is that a substantive difference in the way that you prepare them, or is the preparation the same?
Part of the preparation is the demands of the sport. So understanding where does decision making come into it. If it's a sport like athletics or swimming, where you're doing 100 meters, there isn't a lot of decision making required in that. So you would want the athletes to have made the majority of decisions before they even get to the start line. They're on to automatic pilot there. Whereas if you contrast it with a sport where decisions are influenced by the opposition, so in the case of rugby, and where's the space? In the case of tennis, okay, how is my opposition hitting to me? The decision-making demands are different in sport, so that's why there would be that slightly different approach. And sometimes it's a personality or a psychological feature of an athlete, that some athletes that are not strong on decision-making or are naturally slower there, you simply want them to have to make less decisions, because then you can play to their strengths, where there are other athletes that naturally seem to create that space and time, and their ability to anticipate is incredible. So those are those athletes that have flair naturally, and people kind of describe them, wow, when they're able to do that. So the differentiation is the demands of the sport, but also the nature of the individual. It's certainly not one model fits all.
Understood. Thank you. And the last point that you made about flair, and I'm sure people listening to this will be really struck by just the systematic process of preparation that you're going through, often over a really extended period of time, over years. And I know that, and just as a complete outsider from your expertise, that is there sometimes a risk that you are indeed sort of managing out the talent of the individual, such that that either they're frozen by the processes that you're taking through, and clearly not actually, because that's, but is there a risk of that that somebody's natural talent, which is clearly there at this level, is somehow affected by the more rigorous sort of objective and planned processes that you're working them through?
I think there is, there's naturally a risk of that. It's like when you change someone's technique on any kind of skill, there's an element of risk to it. In terms of the approach that we take with athletes, they are very much front and center, and their coach is a key advisor in it. So the best work that I've been able to do ever has been having both of those individuals in the room, and I'm almost a consultant to that partnership. So it's giving the athlete and empowering the athlete to know what works for them and what doesn't, giving them the tools to work at what's really enhancing performance. And if it isn't, then we kill it off and we go again. What the framework gives them is a sense of a system or a degree of rigor that they've covered all that they need to. And it's really, again, variable and individualized in order to make sure we're getting the best from that athlete. So that I have had experiences where athletes have been so used to the level of emotion that they're dealing with and drawing on that as energy when they're competing, that when that begins to reduce, it's a feeling of, okay, this doesn't quite feel right because I haven't got the same adrenaline rush that I had before. And for some athletes, we need to go back around that and work out how they can re-energize themselves, because that's important to performance. For other athletes, it's simply recognizing that this shift in you is generating greater consistency in performance. And that's really the element that we want for any athlete, is that whatever we're doing to help them is bringing about consistency, because high performance sport is that. Athletes can get psyched up and feel like they've got energized, but if they're doing that and succeeding 1 in 3 times, that's not good enough at the Olympic level. We're talking hundreds of seconds difference between first and second place. But yeah, you're right to be cautious. It's not, we call it a spray and pray effect, where every athlete is cookie cut. We absolutely don't want to do that. But the critical part in all of this work with the athlete is the relationship I have with them, or the relationship that I have with them and the coach. If I'm not seen to have credibility, it doesn't matter what I know about decision making, they will make the fast decision not to work with me. So our relationship's critical.
It's amazing, and something that you did touch on. It strikes me also that the way you described this is it's almost a sort of a kind of a linear process, and I know it's absolutely not, with a bit of a sort of start and an end. You know, you get to that performance moment, and then you've succeeded or you haven't succeeded. Because it's not like that either, is it? Because there's a process presumably of debriefing of after a performance, thinking through the decisions that were made, understanding what went well, what went badly, perhaps using a lot of data now used, isn't it? Something you mentioned a little bit earlier, to analyze that performance in detail. Perhaps just talk us through a little bit about that aspect of how you hone decision making.
Yes, certainly you're right. The whole digital and data world has massively come into sports. You know, the sports fans want to know about it, but athletes definitely use that to inform and to validate the work that they're doing. The way I describe it, Craig, is I'd love it to be linear. I'd love to go from here to here, but you end up going here, back again, and then having to change plan. But what I've learned moving across into business more in recent years is there's actually a terminology for the approach that we take with athletes. And some of your viewers might know it, but it's essentially test and learn. So from the innovation businesses, the Facebooks, the Googles, etc., that's all encompassed within Agile, etc. But actually in sport, we've been doing that for decades, if not hundreds of years, that you go out and you test something, and it's the test and learn process. So I think the cycle is very much this pattern that's going on. So we're going to make this adjustment, we're going to test it, validate it, debrief, go again. So certainly what we don't do with an athlete is go into a darkened gym, do a year's worth of training and suddenly unleash them. Throughout the winter, they've got these regular points of contact, regular results that are telling them their decision making is on track, the training is working. You have those early, not soft competitions, but lighter competitions wherein you're able to test, is that bit stacking up in competition. And then you have key events, particularly going into the Olympic cycle. If you have a Europeans in the same year as the Olympics, you're using that Europeans absolutely as the rehearsal event for the Olympics. So the way I'd describe it, rather than a linear progression, is definitely this test and learn process. It's in much smaller units, but continually it's the validation that the decisions are the right ones. So that feedback is absolutely critical to informing decisions.
So fascinating, Kate. And you did mention briefly this, the link, which has always been there and has been demonstrated in many different ways, between the processes you take a sports person through and business decision making. You have some expertise in that area. Perhaps just say a little bit about where you believe the key lessons that businesses or organizations can take from some of the amazing work that you do with athletes around decision making.
Certainly my a quick realization on that has actually been the feedback part, and this is very psychological in nature, but definitely affects decision making, that none of us like the difficult conversation and we find it hard to give feedback. A contrast I think I've seen in business and sport, or some businesses and sport, is that athletes tend to run towards feedback. They chase it down, they hunt it down, because they're wanting to continually validate that their performance is where it needs to be, to look for the opportunities of gain, and also to get rid of the things that aren't making that boat go faster. And in business, there is, in some of the circumstances I've seen recently in particular, is people's avoidance of giving feedback, of seeking it out, being open to it. And somebody described to me recently, and it was a wonderful picture for me, that the health of an organization or a team is determined by the time between identifying a problem and resolving it, whatever this lag period is. And I've certainly seen in a few businesses where there isn't that feedback-rich culture, it just gets kicked down the track, or person X gets moved to the side. In sport, it's simply much more public and much more overt. If you drop the ball, your team see that, and often thousands of people watching sees that. So there's nowhere to hide.
Feedback is very instantaneous.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've seen a difference around the role of feedback and decision making, which feels really important. But I can absolutely see the parallels in business and sport around that rigor in making data informed decisions, making evidence based decisions. And there's a lot that the sport has taken from business in that parallel, how to make sense of the problem, and to also ensure that we've got valid metrics, because the speed around the track may not be enough. It's looking at the other things that we would need to have. And I think business has really been helpful to sport in showing models of how we can do that more effectively.
That's so interesting. I'm really struck by your point about athletes who seek feedback, and in business, or organizations, you often find the opposite. Is there something that you could characterize? Perhaps it's an unfair question, Kate, but is there something that you could characterize for us for business leaders in the sort of one thing that they should do to try and invert that, if that's the right way of putting it?
I had this exact conversation with a former Irish rugby international, and we were comparing notes on this topic of feedback. And what we both agreed upon is actually it's a relatively simple but difficult thing to do. And that is by leaders showing that vulnerability of, yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to go away and find out. Or what do you guys think about that? Or I've made a mistake here. I want to hear what you guys think, what your suggestion is. So that ability to display vulnerability, not in a weakness sense or in the sense of it being a negative. Vulnerability is about opening our brain pathways for empathy. Most people don't want to see other people struggle or be in anguish. So if we want to get into the really tough performance questions and tough performance conversations, it actually comes from leaping before you look. So as a leader, holding your hand up and saying, I'm not perfect, I don't have everything here, creates that opportunity for connection, openness. And we've heard terms like psychological safety. Those are real things. They're not a psychological psychobabble, pink and fluffy thing on the side. When you've been at an Olympics and you are in a tournament setup, or you're in heats and you have just scraped through, and you are going to get an absolute hiding in the next round unless we look at things. If you haven't created a culture where people can be open, can be vulnerable, can really lean into where the performance gains come from, then you're not going to be successful. So that was certainly our share, was the simple act a leader can take just to hold their hand up and to be vulnerable in that moment. And it massively opens teams. Don't overshare, but using it in the right place.
Right. Kate, that is such a fascinating insight. I think, and unfortunately, we are up against our time, and we always are in these conversations. But I think that's a really great one to end on, with such an interesting insight, which I will take on board as well as a leader. So, Kate, I think Kate Goodger, I think it just remains for me to thank you formally on behalf of the TED Academy of the Royal Air Force, and also the Lincoln International Business School, for your insights over the last 20 minutes or so. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Craig.